Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Better Call Saul Season 1, Episode 9, Pimento. So I'll just say it right off the back, wow. I was totally blown away by this episode. This episode was magnificent from start to finish and totally had me rethinking everything I thought I knew about Better Call Saul. So this episode starts off where last week's left, with Saul and his brother taking on a huge class action lawsuit against a nursing home that's been defrauding its residents. In the beginning, we see Saul in court arguing against the lawyer we saw last week, and we see Saul score a huge victory against him, or at least what he believes is a huge victory, as when he comes home, his brother Chuck reveals that it's not so big of a victory because the law firm's tactic is to bog the case down in as much minutia as possible, as they are completely drowning in paperwork, making it impossible for two people to try alone. So Chuck convinces Saul to defer the case to HHM that will have the manpower to handle a case like this. So before I go any further, I want to talk about this scene in retrospect, because I'm assuming if you're watching this review, you've already seen the episode in its entirety, so you already know the surprise ending, which I'll get more into later. However, I want to talk about what it means for this scene, because it makes me wonder whether or not Chuck is being truthful when he tells Saul that this case is too much for them to handle. In fact, I'm tempted to go back and watch the previous week's episodes, knowing what I know about Chuck. Because in that episode, Chuck seemed content with working with Saul, or should I say his brother Jimmy, and taking on the case. But in this episode, that position has appeared to change. Unless I'm wrong, unless Chuck was always against it and he was just hiding it. However, I do think it's possible that because Chuck was starting to get better, that he's starting to move past his illness, that these feelings he had about Jimmy are reasserting themselves. Whatever the case may be, I now doubt that what he says here about the case being too much for them to handle. Maybe there is some truth to it, but maybe Chuck just gives up a little too easily, because his ultimate goal is really to get Saul off the case, because indeed he doesn't at all seem impressed with Saul's performance in court. It is interesting how Chuck knows Saul will be against deferring the case to HHM, and how strongly he pushes for it. So next I want to talk about the Mike scenes, and I'll just talk about all three of them together, because as much as I love these scenes, there is a disconnect between his storyline and Saul's storyline, as in the two have nothing to do with each other, at least at the moment it would appear so. And I find myself wondering if the only reason the show gets away with having a storyline that seems so disconnected to the main storyline is because it involves a character audiences already know from Breaking Bad, and that the show would never do this with a character audiences weren't already familiar with. And in that case, it's kind of banking off of the audience to have already seen Breaking Bad and not standing on its own, and in that case I'm a bit uneasy about it. That being said, next week's episode may connect Mike's storyline back into Saul's in a huge way. You never know. I hope it does, because it is the last episode of the season, and I would like to feel that these storylines connect. At any rate, the Mike scenes in this episode were absolutely awesome. It reminds us of just how big of a badass Mike is, and it reassures us that he's still a badass even at this point in the story. And the scene where he scares off that big dude that's twice his size was just awesome. And of course, we also finally see Nacho again, and I hope this means he will be integrated back into the main story soon as well. So next scene we get is Saul and Chuck having their big meeting with Hamlin at HHM, and everything seems to be going swimmingly. Hamlin offers Saul a very generous settlement and a finder's fee, until Hamlin not so subtly reveals he doesn't want Saul working on the case with them. So at this point I hadn't figured out it was really Chuck telling Hamlin not to let Saul work on the case, but I knew something was definitely up. I knew that this was, there was some unknown reason behind, beyond simply Hamlin being a douchebag, as to why he was being such an ass to Saul. Okay, so knowing what we know, that Chuck was the one who told Hamlin to do this, it's a bit weird that Hamlin doesn't come right out and say, He doesn't want Saul working on the case. Instead, he assumes that Saul would know this already. This created an awkward situation that I think was for dramatic purposes, because if Chuck had called Hamlin the night before and told him to do this, you think Hamlin would know this would be an issue, so would write out and say it instead of assuming Saul would know this. In fact, Chuck protests and asks Hamlin if he changed his mind. So obviously Hamlin knows that Chuck is going to lie to Saul and pretend that he knows nothing about it. So Saul tells Hamlin he will burn the case to the ground before he hands it over to him, and walks out in anger. I wonder if Chuck saw this coming, and if it was his plan to slowly get Saul to eventually change his mind, because I do think that was the case. So in the next scene, we see Saul's friend Kim go to Hamlin and ask him why he did this to Saul, and trying to get him to change his mind. At first, Hamlin gets mad at Kim and yells at her, so she takes that as a cue to leave, but then Hamlin obviously regrets getting angry at her and asks her to come in and close the door. Then the scene ends. So I heard some speculation about what happened after she closed the door, to whether or not Hamlin offered her a partnership maybe, or all sorts of other theories, but it seems rather obvious to me, and I'm in fact shocked that some people didn't pick up on this, because it seemed pretty obvious that Hamlin told her the truth about why he's not working with Saul, because Chuck told him not to. I mean, it's pretty obvious, especially considering the next scene where Kim tells Saul to take the deal. It's obvious that she knows that Chuck is the one sabotaging him. In fact, her saying that to him is part of what eventually leads Saul to figuring it out. In fact, as soon as Kim went to Saul and told him to take the deal is also when I figured out that it was Chuck. In fact, when Saul was looking at his phone, I was kind of screaming in my mind at him, come on, figure it out. Come on, Saul, it was Chuck. Of course, I already knew this because of the scene we saw with Chuck making a mysterious phone call. So finally, we get the big scene where Saul confronts Chuck about it, and this scene was so amazing. I watched this scene about 4 times in the days since it's aired. So at first, when Saul comes in, he was just sitting there on the couch for about an hour before Chuck even notices him. And at first, as a viewer, I'm still not sure on whether or not Saul knows yet that it was Chuck, because he's acting all nonchalant about it. He tells Chuck that he's going to take the deal and that he regrets getting mad at Kim because he's sure she just had his best interest at heart. And Chuck, of course, seems relieved at this, but he doesn't overplay his hand. He still acts like he would have preferred to work with Saul, and that he'll try to convince Hamlin to reconsider. In fact, after he said that, Saul responded by saying, "Oh, I'm so lucky to have you looking out for me." And that's when it clicked for me. That's when I realized that he knows. Saul knows it was Chuck. And indeed, shortly after, Saul reveals he knows it was Chuck. And then Chuck's response was phenomenal. It was like a gut punch to the stomach. This was some outstanding performances right here, and it was amazing to watch. As Chuck goes on a tirade about how Saul isn't a real lawyer, that he's slipping Jimmy, and that he will always be slipping Jimmy, and slipping Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun. And then Saul responds in what I think was the best way, and in fact only way to respond, by saying that he's absolutely done with him, and from now on Chuck is on his own. So I've heard a lot of debate on whether or not Chuck was in the wrong. In fact, AMC put this one up as a question put forth to audiences: was Chuck actually in the wrong for doing this to Saul? I know the natural instinct is to say yes, but they put forth the possibility that maybe he was right, especially in retrospect that we now know what kind of criminal, shady lawyer Saul will become. Maybe Chuck was right all along. He does have a point about the shortcuts with the online course that Saul took to become a lawyer. However, my 2 cents on the issue: Chuck was absolutely and totally in the wrong. Personally, I think Chuck was being selfish and vindictive, because as Chuck said in his little rant about how hard he had to work to become a lawyer, and Saul was mocking that with his online degree from the University of American Samoa. And I think that's what it boils down to, the whole American attitude of, I worked hard, so everybody else has to. And I have a very strong opinion that this attitude is extremely selfish and self-centered. And even if he told himself otherwise, Chuck wasn't looking out for Saul. He was just looking out for himself and his own selfish sense of pride. Secondly, when Saul says you're always slipping, when Chuck says you're always slipping, Jimmy, you will always be slipping, Jimmy, he's simply letting his preconceived notions get the better of him, and he's refusing to accept that people can change. And in fact, he outright says it, people don't change. And that, my friend, is bullshit. Now, you might say, but wait a second, maybe he had a point, since we know that how Saul eventually turns out. But my counter argument to that is that Chuck, is partly responsible for that. That he would say what he said to Saul about how he'll always be slipping Jimmy turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's already been well established how much Chuck means to Saul. As his whole life he's been striving to be like him. So Chuck saying that to Saul, I'm sure he'll take it to heart. He'll believe him inside that he'll always be slipping Jenny. So he'll stop trying to be better and just embrace the dark side of him. And I submit it was Chuck who drove him to that. That Saul had demonstrated that he could be a good lawyer, that he could do the right thing. The way he handled the Kittleman case was proof of that. The fact that he stumbled across the fraudulent behavior of the nursing home is proof of that as well. And in fact, if Chuck was a decent person, he would have seen that. But he was too bogged down by his preconceived notions and memories of the past about who his brother was. Yes, Saul always had that slipping Jimmy side of him, and probably always will, as we saw that stunt of him painting himself as a hero, but I'm sure he would simply use that to his advantage to become a legitimate lawyer, like he was proving that, he was doing the elderly law, which must have been a really tedious work. But because of what Chuck said to him, now he'll be convinced that he'll never amount to anything, so that will lead him to become the sleazebag that he does. So I say, not only was Chuck in the wrong, but Chuck, in fact, created Saul Goodman. So now I really want to watch the whole series again, as I'm sure I'll have a totally new perspective, because everything I thought I knew will be flipped on its head, particularly with Hamlin, because Hamlin was painted as this asshole, as the bad guy, but now we find out it wasn't Hamlin at all, it was Chuck. And if anything, this makes Chuck even more of an ass, because he was using Hamlin to take all the heat from Saul, when in fact it was Chuck all along. What I think this means going forward is I think Saul will drop his feud with Hamlin, because he knows now it wasn't him that was keeping him down, it was Chuck. I think Saul will simply take the money and never speak to Chuck or Hamlin again, so I think neither character will be in the next season. I also think this means that this will be the end of the Rico case in the show, as Saul was simply handed off to HHM and had nothing more to do with it. I think he'll still keep up his relationship with Kim, so I think she'll continue to be in the show for a while, but my prediction is somewhere down the line, as Jimmy becomes Saul and starts getting into shady practices and sleazy lawyering, Saul and Kim will drift apart, and he will eventually do something to destroy their friendship. What's also interesting to contemplate is that earlier in the season it's been established that Saul could always have Chuck committed to a mental institution that would give Saul control of Chuck's estate and destroy HHM. He would never do that before because he loved Chuck too much, but now that they had a falling out, maybe it's a possibility. Maybe I'm wrong about Chuck and Hamlin, and they will continue to be in the show, and they will try to stop Saul from being a sleazebag lawyer, or in some way try to hinder him, which will eventually lead him to using the nuclear option of having Chuck committed, which would destroy both Chuck and HHM, because after all, Saul has got to know that Chuck's condition is psychological because he suddenly got better when he was trying the case, which also makes me wonder if Chuck is suddenly going to get much worse now that he's had this huge falling out with Saul. Something to think about. Anyway, my prediction is that next week's episode will be the beginning of Saul turning to a life of crime and reconnecting with Mike and Nacho, and that Season 2 will explore this in more detail, and Season 2 will show the birth of Saul Goodman, as I think he will use this money that he'll get from the RICO case to begin his career as Saul Goodman. So my rating for Pimento is a 10, the best. I feel silly ever doubting this show, that this show wouldn't be great. In fact, it probably will, higher my opinions of all the previous episodes now, knowing what it leads to. This episode was simply amazing and completely flipped everything I thought I knew on its head. I really loved it. I really love it when shows can do that, and I'm simply in awe at how amazing storyteller Vince Gilligan is. So that's it for my review of Pimento. You should check out my channel for other reviews on Better Call Saul, and make sure you subscribe to keep up with the future reviews I'll be doing. And thanks a lot for watching.